This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the first week of August 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio, back in the saddle after a 3-week hiatus, and with the usual crew here. Of course, you know him. He is Luke Thomas from the Sirius XM Fight Club and MMA Fighting.com. That is the man with the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com, and of course, the man with the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of MMA Fighting.com. All right, guys, lots to get to this week. Let's get right into it. The big news this week, of course, Anderson Silva versus Nick Diaz, signed, sealed, and delivered for UFC 183, January 31st in Las Vegas. So I'm wondering, of course, they could have gone in many different directions with both of these guys upon their returns, and they went this route. Was this the best route? Was this the biggest fight they can make for both guys?
No, I mean, I guess they could match them up with any other sort of permutation and get still equally big fights. But it's just one of those fights that sort of naturally, organically, these names were put together. And it's a great use of both of them. I see there's like debate online, like, is it a super fight? Is it not? Like, what a dumb argument to have.
The dumbest.
It's the stupidest.
dumbest.
It's the stupidest argument.
Thanks, guys. That was the article I wrote.
The fight's greatness is not a measure of whether it fits in a technical definition or not. It's simply a wonderful meeting of star power. It's unusual matchmaking by the UFC, where they have an 0-2 guy versus an 0-2 guy, and everyone just can't wait for it. It's the right kind of fight because, as we mentioned previously, both guys are probably going to look good, so the loser doesn't really have necessarily that much baggage. More for Silva maybe, but even then he can sort of have a redemptive performance after that long layoff. It's hard to see the downside. The upside's tremendous. Whether or not it's a super fight is entirely irrelevant. An excellent choice by the UFC.
What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. I love this. You know, there's no championship implications here. Both guys have been out for an extended period of time, so there's also that part of it. You know, one of the guys may come back looking great, the other guy may not. I mean, Anderson Silva will be really close to his, I think, like a couple months shy of his 40th birthday when this fight happens. You know, the styles of one guy who just incessantly comes forward, straight forward, against the guy who loves people to come forward. I mean, this is a fight that's going to be so much fun to watch.
Is Anderson Silva a hitter? Is he a hitter? So it
I
seems
think
like
so.
that's what Nick did.
I think he likes to wrestle.
He also throws that spinning shit.
Oh, nice.
You know, it's funny, like, this is one of those fights because there's curiosity as to how these guys will look. Nick Diaz obviously has not been in there in a long time. And then, of course, Anderson Silva coming back from a gruesome injury like that. Would he ever come back? Well, now he's come back. What form does he come back in? Are we going to see like an Anderson Silva from the old days? Are we going to see like a new one, a hesitant one, or a tentative one? Those things are really, they play into this narrative. And I think the fact that both these guys want to fight each other, Nick Diaz had said well before he retired that he would, that was a guy that he'd be interested in fighting. Anderson Silva's camp has been all behind it because they realize that he's not going to be wrestled, that he's going to stand in front of him. I mean, those things are sort of alluring to me. But as far as a competitive fight, that's where I start to get a little bit strange. Yeah. I mean, if Anderson Silva resembles anything like we remember of Anderson Silva, you just feel like this may not be as competitive. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but it seems to me like Anderson Silva, especially being in the bigger body, would have the advantage there. And there's some, it's funny when you think about Nick Diaz. If you look back, he has, in 7.5 years, he has one win in the UFC. We talk about transcendent sort of people. One win in the UFC. This is a UFC-centric market, and he has one win in the UFC. That was a UFC 137 against BJ Penn. You have to go all the way back to 65 for his win against Gleison Tibau. I mean, that tells you a little bit about his appeal, about, how we've talked about him numerous times on the show. Nick Diaz kind of, when he's retired, when he's come back, what's going on, his leverage, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty amazing that he's kind of gotten bigger in scope, I think, over time, through Strikeforce outside the UFC and then in the UFC, and here we are discussing this fight as one of the big fights, which I call a super fight.
Well, it's actually a great point because if you look at his last few fights in the UFC, BJ Penn, Carlos Condit, GSP, now Anderson Silva, that is a murderer's row, but if he loses this fight, that'll be 3 losses in a row. So on paper, it might be a big fight. It's the fight that Nick wanted. Remember, he said he was only coming back for GSP or Anderson, but when it's all said and done, come February 1st, will this be a mistake for Nick Diaz? Will he be looking at a 3-fight losing streak?
If he gets blown out really badly, it could be a bad thing, right? If he's made to look feeble, if he's made to look like, wow, that layoff really did kill you, and you're fighting another guy who's coming off of a worse layoff from a worse circumstance.
Who's bigger than you, too.
And who's bigger. That would be terrible, right? But if he goes in there, even if he loses and performs well, they can salvage that because presumably the fight's going to be at middleweight. But that's, I think, he's not even worried about that. Here's the reality, I think. If he goes in there and beats Anderson Silva, which I admit is unlikely, but stranger things have happened, I think they'll probably give him a title shot. If you go and you beat Anderson Silva, even at middleweight, they're going to go look at what Nick Diaz did. And boy, wouldn't it be great if he can fight either Robbie Lawler, who's a champion, because that's a hell of a rematch, or Johnny Hendricks, because it's just an interesting
So they'll give him a title shot in a different weight class?
I bet you, because it's not because it divisionally makes sense, but because what a sales angle. You not only beat Anderson Silva, let's say he stops him or chokes him out. Again, I admit unlikely, but the it's super high risk, but it is the high reward is enormous. You can get a guy on 2 losses coming in here. If he beats Anderson Silva, sky's the limit.
It's all gravy anyway. I mean, he was retired, guys.
Sure.
We got to see this one extra fight at least.
Well, that's actually a great point, because does Nick Diaz deserve some credit here as a businessman? Because remember, he always said, I'm not coming back unless you A, give me a better deal, and B, give me one of these 2 fights. And remember when he said that at UFC 158 after the loss to GSP, a fight against GSP or Anderson, you must be crazy. And he got both those things, right? He got a better deal, and he got Anderson Silva. He held out. They offered him a whole bunch of other fights, dangerous fights. He said no thanks, and now look at him. Did he kind of set the standard here? Say, you know what? If you sit out long enough, the UFC will come back, or is he just a special case? Is he Nick Diaz?
I mean, he set the standard for Nick Diaz.
Right.
I mean, I don't know that anybody else, or very few people at least, could do what he's done. I mean, as Chuck
move a needle like that.
whatever it is,
Not even his brother, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. I mean, he's not a needle mover, right?
Right.
But as Chuck says, this is a guy who's lost a lot of fights. But I feel like it's almost irrelevant. I mean, I'm always a guy who lives and dies with the meritocracy of how you build up to a title fight. But I totally agree with you. If he wins this fight, they're going to want to put him in a title. They're going to want to put him in with with the champion, even at a division that he didn't win the fight in. It's just because that's just the way they're always looking for the big money fight. And this is a guy who we know is going to perform in an exciting way. We don't know that he's going to win, and I agree with you that if the real Anderson Silva shows up, he could just destroy Nick Diaz. But it will be a really entertaining fight to watch. There's almost no scenario where it wouldn't be entertaining. I guess if he gets blown out in the first minute,
that'd be bad.
That's about it. But other than that, he's going to come forward. He's going to present some problems, and maybe he'll get vanquished. But he's Nick Diaz. I mean, I don't know how much the build up to this fight is going to match. It's going to be hard to match what happened before GSP's fight, but it's going to bring something to the table. But on fight night, you know what he's going to do, and these guys, one guy they're going to be like staring at each other. I mean, come on, this is a win no matter what.
I think the build-up would be great. I mean, I was thinking about the UFC 154 sort of build-up. It got a little strange there with the whole GSP back and forth, dark place, etc. But it was compelling. When you'd sit in there, the tension, that's good fight game tension. When you're sitting in a room and a guy is just holding the tension just like that, from the promoter standpoint all the way to the media and onlookers, etc. The other fighters are sort of sitting there, rolling their eyes and stuff. That's great. I mean, if he's able to even duplicate any of that, which he will because he has that sort of raw energy kind of off the top of his head, and innocence or ignorance, I'm not, you could split that in the middle one way or another. Ignorance meaning like sometimes he doesn't know certain things that are happening within the stuff, but I look at it sort of an innocence as well, but it's all very raw and it translates really well. It becomes very compelling. So I think the lead up is part of the allure of this whole thing.
And I just want to clarify something. I don't think the discussion of whether or not it's a super fight or not is dumb because it's not a super fight. I just think it's dumb to even argue about this, because if we're going to nitpick about whether or not #superfight applies to this fight, I mean, now we're just being, spoiled brats. I mean, it's a great fight. It's somewhat of a dream fight. Who would have ever thought this would have happened? So that's what I meant by that. I mean, I consider it a super duper fight, right?
I accept your
whether or not it falls under the actual, category.
Create that hashtag.
Super
duper.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me ask you guys this. I mean, Nick Diaz says time and again, he said it on the conference call on Wednesday, I don't like to fight. I don't enjoy this. Don't ask him if he's excited, because he'll get really pissed off. I've learned that many times. I'm doing this because I have to, etc., etc. We were all very excited about this fight when it was rumored, several weeks ago. But when you start to hear someone say, I don't like to fight, I don't want to do this, I want to do something else, but this is all I know, essentially. Don't you kind of feel weird about it? Do you feel weird watching it and being a part of it?
No.
He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to get punched in the face. He doesn't want to be violent. He doesn't want to be represented this way. He's very clear about that. So I feel a little uncomfortable about the whole situation. Like, why
we're abusing him?
No, I don't want to support. This is a serious thing. You're going to cage with a guy who can do a lot of damage to you, right? Anderson Silva, of all people. And he doesn't want to do it. When do you ever hear that? When do you ever hear...
A lot of people don't want to go to their job, though. I mean, a lot of people don't want to go to their job. They do it.
Yes, but to go in a cage and get punched in the face, it feels weird, right?
Yeah, but coal miners have it 1,000 times worse.
Exactly, but we don't buy popcorn and pay to watch them.
That's because their job is boring as hell to watch.
Yeah.
You don't find it weird that he's going into a fight kind of begrudgingly? He doesn't want to do this.
GSP, you know, GSP before the, I guess before the Hendricks fight, he was talking about, and I think he's talked about it prior to other fights as well, about how, you know, I'm always afraid when I go into a fight. And
being afraid and not wanting to do something, I think, are two different things. Those are pre-fight nerves.
I think it's different ways of expressing something. You know, clearly Nick Diaz has been off for what, a year, right? And clearly he wants to be doing this. He's come back. Nobody came and put a gun to his head and said, "Come on back here, you got to fight." He came back because this is what he does well. And maybe he doesn't. I think that he just doesn't understand, or he doesn't. He gets asked, "Are you excited to go in and step in with Anderson Silva?" And he responds by saying, "Well, why would somebody be excited to stand in a cage with Anderson Silva?" And I understand. I wouldn't be excited about standing in a cage. I couldn't make 185 anyway, but
sure.
but if I could. You know, I understand where he's coming from a human perspective, but this is what he does, and part of his psyche is to say, I don't really enjoy doing this, but this is what I do. I have to do this.
I think that's true. Like what you just said, I think it's part of his psyche to get himself into the mode of where he actually does it. You know, that's what it seems like to me, because he's said these types of things before, and you see him on Fight Night, and he's worked himself up into something that's we all. Like you're saying, eat the popcorn with, you know, watch, so that he's Nick Diaz, now he's going to, you know, but I feel like that's a whole psych up process for him too. He goes through a lot of different, different things through his camp, it seems like, to get ready for that moment.
It also was a little bit more disturbing for me, and I think that you brought this up in one of our previous shows, the quote from BJ Penn about, you know, was it like fish swim, birds fly, you know, and I fight. I mean, and he didn't quite understand why he does it and why he was still doing it, and yet he was going into a fight with Frankie Edgar, and so that was a guy who, at one time was the greatest or one of the greatest in the world, and now we saw was somewhat of a shot fighter, and he was not quite sure how to define himself and what it was that made him keep going. We haven't really seen that with Nick Diaz. He hasn't been winning, sure, but that's because he's been facing the best of the best. But we've never seen him look like a guy whose better days have passed him by. If we see that at the end of January, then maybe we start thinking about him differently.
How about this? How about fighters lie to you and themselves all the time? I actually see it as kind of healthy. Nick Diaz does not lie to himself. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here, but I'm going to do it because there are other reasons. I'm going to make money, maybe I'll win, maybe that'll lead to more money and I can save that money and open up a business or whatever it is that he wishes to do the rest of his life. But so many fighters are like, yes, I want to be there and I'm ready to take on the best and blah, blah, blah. And it's just them lying to themselves so they can perform the best, which is fine. I don't begrudge them doing that. But Nick Diaz is able to channel an inner ferocity without having to do that. He does not have to lie to himself to have a elite level of fighting performance, which to me is crazy that he can do that. But I actually see it as rather healthy. He understands who he is, what he likes, what he doesn't. It's a very rational calculation that he's making. It only becomes troublesome for me on what he brought up, is when you get into that Jens Pulver territory where you have to fight simply to make ends meet. That's not where we're at with Nick Diaz. So for now, I'm okay with it.
And I guess the good news is it's good to have him back. You know, those quotes, those conference calls, I mean, it's just good to have Nick Diaz back. Do you believe this will lead to his brother coming back, or do you think both cases are exclusive? One has nothing to do with the other.
From the outside looking in, it's hard to say. I don't know what you know, and maybe so. You can certainly see a circumstance where his brother will probably be cornering him for this fight, you know, and we'll be there and we'll see it. And
you would hope by January 31st he'd be back, right?
You would think maybe. It's certainly, you can never rule it out. The difference certainly is that Nick Diaz's circumstance was born of an environment where his services were just substantially more in demand. He could do those sorts of things. The turning down the Hector Lombard fight, whatever else they threw at him, worked because they need stars. They got to put on. I think they want to put on bigger fights on these pay-per-views, especially in the wake of 174. It worked for him. Nate Diaz, candidly, I support him if he wants to get more money. I would never accuse a guy of he should get out there and fight. No, he should do what he wants to do. However, speaking rationally, he simply doesn't have the leveraging power, and one wonders at what point what the end game is here. Is he simply okay with not fighting anymore, or will the financial necessity simply push him in one direction?
Let's quickly touch on this because you joked about it. Do you believe he is a needle mover like his brother, Nate?
I don't think like his brother. I don't think he's in that same level. But there, you could make an argument that he was as much of a contender as Nick was, at a time. Mm-hmm. So he's certainly a guy who has had times where he's risen right up toward the top of his division. I don't know that he's quite on that same level, but to sort of jump off of what Luke just said about as time passes, one of the things that's going to happen is that Nate's going to be in the gym training with his brother, helping his brother prepare for a fight, and maybe the juices start going and flowing a little bit, and he starts thinking about, I want to be back in there. And like you said, I also support a fighter holding out for what he believes he's worth. But at a certain point, he might start. The UFC, what they're willing to give him might go up a little bit. What he's willing to take might go down a little bit. Maybe they'll find a place. I think he's gonna have to swallow his pride a little bit more than Nick did, though.
I think if the Gilbert Melendez contract, that whole thing that happened, was a catalyst for him to sort of be holding out. I think his brother coming back, who was very influential on him, fighting again, seeing all that will be a catalyst for him to return. And he'll probably, at that point, I think he'll understand the leverage thing of what's going on. Obviously, his situation is completely different. What's different than Nick Diaz, I think he fights again. I think he'll be back before, probably in that same range, I would think, before Nick gets in there.
Last word?
Very quick about needle moving. I think when Dana White said it, what he meant was basically pay-per-view. That's what he meant, like, can you sell on pay-per-view? But I would just say in Nate Diaz's defense, I don't think he can sell pay-per-view like Nick Diaz. But in a sport and an organization that's put on 50 events a year, maybe more next year, we'll see, the ability to sell pay-per-view is not necessarily the most important. Ben Henderson can't, and he has substantial value to them. They need headliners. They need guys who can serve in co-main event roles. Nate Diaz is very valuable in that context.
All right, speaking of, some potentially big draws for the UFC, there's a developing story right now involving Eddie Alvarez, because obviously there's a new regime in Bellator. It's led by Scott Coker, and Scott Coker in the past, he was faced with a very similar situation when it came to Jake Shields. Jake Shields was running out of time in Strikeforce, and the UFC was interested, and instead of getting into a bidding war with the UFC, he washed his hands of Jake Shields and said, here, you take him, thus, in my opinion, decreasing Jake Shields' leverage. Now he's faced with a situation with Eddie Alvarez where he has one fight left on his contract, and he's the champion. If he fights that last fight in Bellator, he can walk away from Bellator as the champion and obviously be very attractive to the UFC. If he washes his hands of the situation, A, he decreases Eddie Alvarez's leverage, and B, he sends the signal, in my opinion, to the rest of the MMA community, we're fighter friendly, we're not like the old regime, we're not going to hold you back. If you don't want to be here, you can go. What do you think Scott Coker will do with Eddie Alvarez?
Don't let him go. I think it's the right move, too, let's just sort of look at the facts. I don't think Michael Chandler is going to blow the doors off Eddie Alvarez if they fight a third time. It's probably going to be like the first two. Crazy, close, ridiculous kind of thing. So then you're just taking a risk on a coin flip, basically. I definitely don't think, all respect to Will Brooks, that Eddie Alvarez can't beat him. I think Eddie Alvarez will walk over Will Brooks, at least the current version of him. So you're in a situation where, like, even if you want to go forward with keeping Alvarez, you stand a very bad possibility of having your organization's champion just simply leave because he has all the opportunity in the world. Eddie Alvarez, even on your show, a number of times. And then that crazy back and forth with Will Brooks, doesn't seem to want to be in Bellator anymore. Maybe he likes Scott Coker, maybe he doesn't, but I think he's ready to be done, make some real money because he's got 3 kids. And if you're Scott Coker, you're trying to be the anti-Rebney. I think he is in many ways naturally, but you want to go in there and say, it's a new start for the brand. It's a new start for the relationship. It sucks to lose him. It sucks even more to retain all the old bad feelings that Rebney had generated.
What a greater message you could send than that, right? This was the greatest feud in Bellator, Rebney versus Eddie Alvarez, and he could just say, hey, you don't want to be here? See you later.
Yeah, it's funny to characterize a guy like Eddie Alvarez and say that he's looking for a challenge after he's fought a couple of the most vicious fights ever in MMA with Chandler, but he does seem like a guy who's looking for that next challenge, and he certainly would find it in the UFC, and it makes sense for him to be there. And I think you characterize it right. I mean, on the one hand, I think, well, if I'm Scott Coker, I want to put on big fights, and Alvarez is a property. He's somebody that can put on some big fights for me. But actually, right, what he really can do is put on big fight, because he's only got one on the on the contract, and so that's not good enough. If I'm Coker, I do have to think a little bit beyond the immediacy of that one fight and think, well, could we get this guy for a long-term deal? I'm not Bjorn Rebney. You want to do business with me? And if the answer is no, then they got to start looking in a different direction.
It's hard, because Eddie Alvarez has been there since Bellator 1. He's one of those guys you're going to associate with Bellator. Maybe forever. We may, even if he goes to the UFC, we still may regard him as a Bellator guy in the end, who knows. But he's been there since, he's always been also the target, that all these guys, they're working this system under the Bjorn, era. It was like they're working the system, going through these tournaments. You got guys who actually came up. It actually worked. This was the one time it seemed like, that weight class particularly it sort of worked. Like, you got guys to come up, Michael Chandler, and then, and Will Brooks, who, were real challenges. And then you get to that point, and it's like, here we are, he doesn't want to be there, all this stuff, and you get a new guy coming in, Scott Coker. It's like a travesty for everything that stood. It was already sort of going in a bad direction. I know we've talked about this a million times, but it's sort of a travesty for it to kind of go like this. You'd like to see him fight. I'd like to see that trilogy fight with Michael Chandler.
More so than a UFC fight?
And I would say, you'd like to see all of that. If you're really good. If he's going to fight that last fight, you'd like to see that trilogy fight. I mean, it was a big fight. But if he's going to fight a guy like Cowboy Cerrone, it's hard for me not to say, wow, what a ridiculous fight. Because the partition, you're like, wow, no, there's all this other possibility for Eddie Alvarez. I like that aspect a lot more, ultimately. But it's a hard situation, and it sort of sucks for anybody who sort of, followed the trajectory of all that Bellator buildup to get to these points, just to have it sort of end like this.
I always thought that 2-fight deal that Eddie Alvarez signed with the old regime made no sense for that current regime, because he could walk away with the belt. No one wants to see that happen. And they got the perfect out. When he got hurt and Will Brooks became the interim champion, now you could just say, goodbye, right. He's our guy. He beat Michael Chandler, Will Brooks is the champion, you do that rematch. At the end of the day, it might be one big fight, but is Eddie Alvarez going to change the course of Bellator's history? Not really at this point, right? I mean, you might as well wash your hands and not be embarrassed with him. He's not going to show up on UFC TV with a Bellator belt, but no one wants to see that happen to their organization.
No. And I think if you go back and if you recall what Bjorn Rebney said about why, I asked him, why would you go white knuckle with one of your own guys? He doesn't want to be like, what are you doing, And his response was that this is an organization that I am in charge of, and we world-class fighters will come here and they will stay here because this is an organization that's going to have world-class fighters. In other words, when you come here, I am growing something so serious now that when you come here, you should expect that. In other words, he sort of put on these legal parameters rather than what Scott Coker wants to do, which is create a climate so friendly and so interesting to you that you want to stay. And I think those two things, if you can't make him want it, then that's sort of the end of it, really.
And Coker's already sending out those good vibes, because that's what they did with Joe Riggs. Joe Riggs won Fight Master, didn't want to be there.
That is so weird, by the way.
And they let him go. They let him go. They don't want to be in business with guys who don't want to be there. Right. And I say kudos to them. That's part of changing the atmosphere at Bellator. Now, the rumored fight.
I was going to say that's the long looking at. That's what I was talking about before, about looking at the business in the long run. And not just saying, well, Riggs won our reality show, so let's keep him here. Well, no, look at what's going to happen down the road, because the UFC is always cutting fighters and guys' contracts run out. You want to be an alternative.
If it doesn't fit the new vision, what they're trying to do, then why would you keep them around anyway? I mean, they're getting rid of the tournament structure, all that stuff's going. It's all going to be more traditional and all. Why are you going to keep around guys who don't want to be there?
Now, Sherdog reported that the fight being talked about is Eddie Alvarez versus Donald Cerrone at UFC 178, which to me is like the rich get. Yes, please, Chuck. The rich are getting richer.
Boring fight, my God.
You don't like it?
This guy's going to stare at you. No, of course I like it. Come on.
Is that the fight that you think makes most sense for Eddie upon his UFC debut?
There's an abundance of fights that I think that would be really awesome to watch. I mean, that's the thing, when you get a guy who's coming in from another organization, you can just tick off a whole list of guys that'd be really fun. And Cowboy Cerrone, he's always fun to watch. So why not throw him right in there with that? Why not?
It's crazy too. I mean, you were just in Ireland. Conor McGregor. I mean, just that fight alone, being on there with Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier, and then you add that. I mean, there's intrigue upon intrigue, just like layers of intrigue going on with that card.
And you know what's amazing? Some of these great fights are going to be on the prelims. It's 100. I mean, you look at how many fights are, and if you add this one, you know, you have Kennedy, Romero, Zingano, Nunes, Dominic Cruz, Masvidal, Green. One of them, or maybe even two, are going to end up on the.
I think Jones. Cormier goes
yeah,
to the
probably.
I think it's going to be a fight pass.
It's amazing how they're really stacking the deck. So let's
Is it amazing, or is that how cards should be?
No, well, it's not like it has been in the past year. So why are, you know, I can tell you something. You look at the pay-per-view card for 177. They could use a couple of those fights. Now they've run out of time to add, but you know what I'm saying. They're really pinpointing that card.
UFC 176 is happening this weekend. This should be a big.
Come on. Yeah. Why'd you have to go there? But does UFC 178 really need Cerrone Alvarez? You know what I'm saying?
I think it does. I mean, no. I mean, it doesn't need it. But I think, like, I was trying to explain to other people, like why are they like, look at 177's card. It's Detroit versus UFC 178. It's like, you know, it's like Fifth Avenue or something. And so I was trying to explain, like, people are like, well, to your point, it's a calendar issue. But there's another point that's like, why make two like potentially good events when you can have one blockbuster event? Blockbuster events, they're signposts. They're moments you remember much more. They have greater impact. Cerrone versus Alvarez is not going to, quote unquote, move the needle on pay-per-views very much at all. They're beloved figures, but they're not necessarily pay-per-view commodities in that way. But it's a way to. That's a return to the customers, man. We are going to give value to the customers, both in the know and not in the know, and we're not going to necessarily use that as a way to make them the most kind of money. I really respect that. That's how cards should be built. That's what's been missing. The more they can do that, the better.
It's also an insurance policy. You know, with pay-per-views especially, you know, the one that was supposed to happen this weekend, the main event goes away, the whole card goes away. So if you can build a card that, even if it loses a main event, obviously that really hurts the card immensely. But if you've got a really, really killer card all the way down there, you might be able to still do some business.
It is amazing how our standards have changed, right? This was the norm just a couple of years ago.
It's fun to have it like this again, at least in scope. I mean, like we were talking about on the train ride in, you know, these things change because people get injured. But if everything stays intact for 178 going for the rest of 2014 and into 2015, look at that. Look at the fights that are coming up, and you know, all the title fights are pretty compelling. You have at least a big draw if Carano does come on to the UFC and fights Rousey. There's some hypotheticals in those ways. Every single one of these, you know, title fights and everything else, they all look big. It's like the old days when everything was sort of rolling, the boom days when this was all going. It's sort of fun after coming out of like the dearthy area of the first part of 2014.
What's funny about 178 is when they announced a lot of those fights, everyone said, please, injury bug, stay away from 178. And then the next day, Gustafsson pulls out. But it's one of those weird situations, and correct me if you disagree or argue against me, one of those weird situations where the replacement fight is more anticipated than the original fight. Jones-Cormier seems to have more buzz than the rematch between Jones and Gustafsson. Do you agree?
I totally agree. Jones, when I was on MMA Uncensored, we had Cormier on. He was still a heavyweight. I think he may have still even been in Strikeforce at the time. Strikeforce was owned by Zuffa, obviously, but he was in Strikeforce. And I remember him asking, like, I think the beef between he and Jones had just sort of like rolled a little bit. It was still kind of friendly, jokey, yet whatever. And I was asking what it was, and he was asking him to, I think he'd met him at a show, wanted to sit next to him, and Jones had either been rude or like semi-rude / jokey, and or you know what, I'm going to beat you one day, or something of that kind of thing. So to my point is this. Like Jones and Gustafsson, I still want to see that rematch. I don't think anyone doesn't care about that anymore. But that was a rivalry born out of a fight, and that's a great way to have a rivalry. It's even better when there's a rivalry and they've never, ever, ever done anything but maybe shake hands. These are two guys who, and I hate to use this phrase, but it's true this time. They legitimately don't like each other. But it's a real thing this time, and moreover, it's one of these fights where even if these guys were best friends, the technical level on display, you are looking at two guys with unbelievably high fight IQs, different kinds but equal levels of athleticism. Cormier, a little bit older, but Jones in his prime. This will be a fight we talk about, I think, for years and years to come.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me even more is that it's a fight that we want to talk about now in the lead up to it. I was on the Sports Illustrated Daily Show earlier, like it was the end of last week, and I said something dumb, which I know you guys are going to have a hard time believing, but what I said was that Daniel Cormier poses the first threat to Jon Jones in his since he's been fighting, which wasn't true because obviously Alexander Gustafsson posed a threat. But what I actually had meant to say, what my intention was to say that this was the first fight where the anticipation is that Jones is going to be threatened. I mean, look at the Gustafsson lead up. Nobody thought he was going to win the fight. It seems like all the fights preceding that, even when he was fighting ex-champions, the idea was that Jones is going to run right through them. This is a fight where I don't think anybody thinks that Jon Jones is going to run through Daniel Cormier. And so from now until the night that they step into the cage, there's going to be a lot of back and forth, not just between the fighters, but between fans who are on each side. And we haven't seen that with Jon Jones. We haven't seen anybody say that, oh, this guy's going to just wreck Jon Jones. It just doesn't happen.
We had seen Gustafsson lose. We had seen him in fights where it was the thing was in doubt. We haven't really seen that with Daniel Cormier. Anytime you get this sort of invincible force, he was coming up on fighting King. If King weren't his buddy, he was going to contend for that heavyweight belt. He would have by now. He's one of those guys we haven't seen in vulnerable situations. He's been fairly dominant, at least, I don't know about his very early fights, but at least in his strike force all the way into the UFC, and he's gotten better. And he's not, even being a big kind of heavy, strong heavyweight, he's not knocking guys out. And it's almost to his benefit because he is a cerebral fighter. He is very skilled. He knows how to beat guys. He knows how to wear you down. I think only out of his last 9 fights, where those are really the centric fights that we'd be talking about anyway, 5 of those went to a decision. He's a guy who can sap sort of the will and energy out of you in a fight. We see it all the time. Those things are incredibly exciting when you think of him fighting Jon Jones. All of a sudden this thing becomes, there's a lot of layers to look at in a fight like that. And it's not just the length and the strength and everything like that. There's Daniel Cormier is a real competitor. He's been doing it his whole life. He knows how to win. He has, the power, the strength, and all of that to do it, but he also has the brain and the technical skill. To me, it's like you couldn't get any better than that. And I agree 100% with the Gustafsson thing was born more of the fight, so it was like the anticipation of the fight. There was no sidelines to the whole thing. This thing has the sidelines as well.
July was a very busy month for the UFC, a lot of shows, and there was some bad news. The cancellation of UFC 176. A few more drug test failures. I mean, there was definitely some bad news, but it feels like it's a good stretch for the UFC. No real controversy as far as fights or big fights are concerned. The great Ireland show was, just feel good all around. You couldn't have booked a better show, and just some good, exciting news to talk about, like Anderson Silva and Nick Diaz. To me, also, you can include in that discussion what happened in Nevada last week with Vitor Belfort and Chael Sonnen, because it just gave us some closure to those stories. They weren't just kind of...
You walked away with a good feeling?
Why I walked away with a good feeling was I just don't want to think about it anymore. I'm done with those guys. I'm done with that TRTs. I just want to move on. But why it felt incomplete was because Wanderlei Silva is still waiting in the wings, right? I want to put closure on that story, and hopefully all these drug test fails and that 175 debacle with all those guys. So my question is, of course you can nitpick and we could get into that, what they did right or wrong that day. But given what happened that day to Chael and Vitor, what should they do with Wanderlei Silva? And should they act fast so that we can move on from all of this?
When you say they, you mean?
Nevada.
Nevada. They're going to do probably very little.
You think?
Yeah.
He ran away from a drug test.
So? Dude, that doesn't mean anything anymore.
Okay, what should they do if you're in charge?
They're probably hiring him, bring him on as
exactly. As a consultant.
God, what a
Given
farce.
what they showed us, their stances now, and how they act, what should they do?
They'll probably give him a year. Should is a difficult discussion because we haven't sort of fleshed out all the issues. Nor have we heard Wanderlei's side with a lawyer, which I'm sure I assume he'll have when he returns, about what it all means. I mean, I suspect he'll probably get a year punishment and some kind of relatively modest monetary fine. But my only point about all this is, like, you're like relieved about it because it's over, and I'm like, it's so not over. It's not even close to over. Nevada is the commission is a team of bureaucrats, some more well-intentioned than others. Mm-hmm. That Marnell character seems to be a guy who he at least seems to be cracking the whip on
Thought you'd like him.
Yeah, well, you know what? I don't agree with everything.
A little inconsistent, though, right?
Totally inconsistent.
Where was the whip during the Vitor?
Yeah, of course, totally inconsistent, but at least kind of cracking the whip a little bit. And I thought that was important. But it's I'm not here to praise one or blame the other. I'm simply saying these are bureaucrats and they're in service to the state. Do we really think that while they have a job to do, that they're going to create a regulatory climate so harsh that people aren't going to want to do business there. Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. So while they will give Wanderlei some measure of a punishment, they gave Sonnen, I thought the 2 years was okay. I didn't care about any kind of monetary fine. Although Nick Diaz just got murdered for smoking weed, which is just LOL. But here's the point is this. I mean, could you think of a dumber thing to do with taxpayer dollars? It's ridiculous.
I like your usage of the term LOL.
So, but I just to close, I just believe that everyone's like, the Nevada Athletic Commission, they let everyone down. This is what they do. They're serving the state's interest. They have to regulate, they have to show a little bit of force, but they cannot get people who spend millions of dollars and draw millions of dollars to the state to be so hampered by regulation they choose to go elsewhere.
I think you sell the Nevada Athletic Commission short here because
I definitely sell it short.
Because here's the UFC putting on their Fight Pass subscription service one of their hearings, and up till now, all we got, you pay $10 for this service. You got a fight library, an occasional fight card from Europe or Asia or something. Now they're actually putting comedy shows on, which I think is just this was the most. I don't know if you guys watched the whole thing. I mean, I not only watched the Vitor and Chael part, but
Vitor crying was worth my $10 all month.
How about they got down on their knees and bowed down to the god that is Floyd Mayweather. I mean, because he wants to be a promoter there. They grilled some guy earlier on because he had some kind of jail.
Alexis Villa.
Yeah, and then Floyd, they got down, they bowed down, they kissed his ring. Vitor, they're giving bro hugs. I mean, they're like, oh man, this was just absolute comedy. And I think I can't imagine when they get Wanderlei Silva out there. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll buy him track shoes or something for the next time he has to run away from a test.
If I'm Wanderlei Silva, I come in with my punishment in mind because that's exactly what Vitor Belfort did. He laid down his own parameters. He laid down his own parameters, promised not to fight, all the stuff, and that's exactly what they gave him. So if I'm him, I go in with that in mind. I'm going to lay down my own punishment and just let them give it to me. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that they did a good job. I'm just so tired of talking about this stuff and maybe this is the wrong way. Maybe a journalist shouldn't think this way. But that's why That's why I enjoyed Ireland so much. It was just all positive. Being there with those people is you didn't have to talk about drug. There was no controversy. There was no black cloud hanging over this event. And I'm not getting into the Conor McGregor thing. It just felt
yes, you are. You're trying to.
It felt like an escape from the daily BS that we were dealing with over the last couple of months. I mean, it just kind of wears on you. And I'm not saying that they did a good job or that they were consistent or anything like that. But I would just love to put a bow on all that stuff that happened earlier in the summer and just move on and start. And we shouldn't be that way. Honestly, I'm saying this is maybe a mistake on my part. I'm just tired. I'm tired of it.
Do you really think there's a bow on it when there's Vitor Belfort has a fight coming up in early December, and between now and then, presumably they're going to be testing him, every 10 minutes or something? I mean, do you think that the UFC has to hold its breath every time?
But why are we taking so long to deal with Wanderlei? That's my point.
Because he's not relevant.
He's run by bureaucrats.
He's also not relevant.
He can't make the money.
We saw. I'm making jokes about Floyd Mayweather and Vitor being praised. Well, Vitor Belfort is going to be in a main event in the UFC, which brings a lot of money to Nevada.
Yep.
Floyd Mayweather has brought a lot of money into Nevada. Chael Sonnen's a retired fighter, so give him a 2-year suspension. Who cares? He's retired. He's not bringing any more money in there. Wanderlei Silva, where's his relevance? Is he going to bring any money to Nevada? So, he's at the bottom of the agenda.
This might be music to Meta Morris's ears. Get that Chael Sonnen thing going over there.
Dude, hilarious that Drysdale and Casey, 2 jiu-jitsu black belts, come over and pop. Crazy.
Again, I'm not saying they did the right thing or didn't do the right thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting old. And I like to focus on the positives.
I think your point is well stated. It's like we didn't get into this for all this regulatory nonsense,
yes.
And I think it's a very fair claim and it's a very understandable one. But it's never over. It's never over. If you can find your Corona moment where you're on the beach and you're actually on the bus stop,
Ireland,
yes,
right. It was romantic.
That was your pot of gold.
It was romantic.
If you can find your beach, your Corona moment, do it, man. But that's not.
It's actually his Guinness moment, really. But
that's your Guinness moment.
But imagine being a baseball writer and you've just first, you know, one of the boys of summer watching games, and all of a sudden you start hearing about the steroid stuff, and then your job suddenly becomes writing about, you know, what this guy was injecting, what this guy was doing, and you're hearing about drugs with long names you've never heard of.
That's rich coming from this guy who told us on our last show of last year that this would be the story of this year.
Well,
Here we are.
It luck box into that one.
It is the story. I'm also the guy that called Nick Diaz versus Anderson Silva. I'll have to say that as well.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah, go back and see that.
Take all the credit. Take all the credit.
No, but this is the reality we live in. But it's because, you know, the world has changed. The world of sports has changed. It's not just MMA. It's the world of sports in general.
And I think one more thing on this. I think as journalists, especially MMA journalism, where it continues to evolve and get better, we should pay attention. We should dig deeper. I guess removing myself and, you know, just trying to enjoy or recognize why we got into this in the first place. It's nice to have some positive things to talk about for a change. All right, speaking of which, August is another busy month in the world of MMA. There are a ton of fights all over the place. Fight Pass, Fox Sports 1, pay-per-views, all that good stuff. I'm wondering, is there a fight in particular that you want to pinpoint as must-watch, maybe one that's flying under the radar, one that you're excited about? Anything come to mind? You laugh. There's nothing that comes to mind, I'm assuming.
The return of Royston Wee. Besides that, which is actually a real thing, he is coming back on the Lee versus Bisping card. Honorable mention will go to Brandon Thatch, Jordan Meehan.
Yes.
That's
You son of a... That was mine.
I'll just say honorable mention. I'll pass off to you why you like that. For me, you could go, I think, one of two directions. You can go Henderson versus Dos Anjos.
Yep.
But I am actually going to pick Jussier Formiga and Zach Makovsky.
Big one.
I really like Zach Makovsky. I like the improvement he's been making. A lot of people thought that when Chris Carriasso got the title shot that it should have been Makovsky. I was one of them. I think he'll have a tough fight in Formiga, but I think he'll get past it. And I like him to challenge Demetrius Johnson next.
Wow.
All right. Well, before we go under the radar, I do want to acknowledge that the Dillashaw rematch is this month. So that's not my under the radar choice, but that is a fight that
I still don't know how I feel about it.
Well, whether you feel like the match should have been made or not, or should have been waited, they should have waited later. It's going to be something else to watch,
especially in Sacramento.
Yeah. Where it should be. Yeah. Where it should be. Yeah. A champion should not have to travel to some other place unless he chooses to and gets compensated for it. The fight that I'm sort of interested in, and I don't know how, I'm not sure how it's going to go, is the new signee, Henry Cejudo. Just because, we're talking about Daniel Cormier, Olympian. I want to see a guy that's an Olympic gold medal. I want to see how he competes, and they're not giving him a gimme. You got him with Scott Jorgensen, who is coming out of he just broke a 3-fight losing streak, so he's back on the winning track, and he's got some work to do to get back up into contention. So I want to see how this new guy, who's raw and has not been tested at anywhere near this level of competition, how he does in that fight. So I'm going to watch him.
I like it.
What do you mean you're not into Barao and Dillashaw? He said he got hit in the first round. He woke up in the locker room.
Yeah, I don't know.
He wasn't there the last four
Hashtag brain safety.
That fight to me has some, there's some compelling features to that because I don't, because of that. I'm not sure that we saw Barao in his 100%, and we're not sure if you caught Dillashaw and really being that guy. So to me, it's like, I have no problem with that fight. I'm looking forward to that. But he hit on the Brandon Thatch, Jordan Means. To me, that fight sticks out because I think Brandon Thatch is one of those guys who's sort of coming up. He got derailed a little bit with these injuries, but his fights, the way he's looked, and sort of like talking to the guys in Colorado who he's training with and stuff. I think a lot of people are excited. I think he's going to be a contender. I think he's going to be a contender in 2015. So this is a tough kid he's going to fight. I think that's a fight I'm going to be, have special interest in to see how he looks coming off of the injury.
I want to give an honorable mention to Bisping Lee, which is the easy route, only because this could be the end of Michael Bisping's career. He has said it himself. His back is against the wall, and I think his story is somewhat tragic because one of the most popular and controversial, polarizing figures in UFC history, never got a title shot, has the eye injury, and who knows, what that derailed. And also fought a lot of guys, if you look back at history, who were on TRT, who stopped him from, getting that title shot. This is a very big fight. It's on Fight Pass, and I think it's an important one for him. Also for Kung Lee, who, it feels like it happened 10 years ago, knocked out Rich Franklin in brutal fashion. But the fight, I'm very intrigued by this fight, Shayna Baszler versus Bethe Correia, because Bethe is a possible opponent sooner rather than later for Ronda Rousey. She beats Jessamyn Duke in Baltimore, puts up the 4 fingers and puts one down. She beats Shayna Baszler.
Yeah,
she has
good
2
point.
left. She's probably not going to fight Marina Shafir, but I think she gets fast-tracked if she has a good performance. If the Gina Carano thing falls through, I think she might get fast-tracked to Ronda Rousey, and no one's really talking about her as a potential opponent for Ronda, but that's some good trash talking right there, especially coming from someone who doesn't speak English.
Yeah.
So I like that, but I like that storyline, I
Something
guess.
very translatable about.
Yeah, it's
Megan.
great. It's great. So that's one that I'm looking forward to. It's
Yeah.
taking place on the pay-per-view for UFC 177. A lot of good fights coming up, and it's an interesting month ahead. It was an interesting month in July. We appreciate you stopping by. So much happened this month. We touched on a little bit, but let us know if we forgot anything. Let us know if there's a fight you're looking forward to coming up this month in what is another busy month for the UFC and the entire sport of mixed martial arts. We'll be back for the next few months because it's a bit of a quiet time as far as travel is concerned, so do not go anywhere for now. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. We'll see you next week right here on the MMA Beat.